Welcome back, everyone. And I have John Langan back for us to talk about something a little bit off the beaten path. We're going to talk about the paranormal. Not sure where this is going to go. It'll probably be very similar to my discussions with T.C. McCarthy about skinwalkers at the Pentagon and the various paranormal intelligence programs that have we've seen declassified documents of. Whether or not it's a government disinformation campaign or not, who knows. But John, are you familiar with kind of the remote viewing and kind of how our government is in like Project Stargate, Sunstreak, Center Lane, and a number of other declassified, I wouldn't say declassified programs, but programs that the information upon which that has been declassified. Are you familiar with any of those?
Some of it, yeah. I mean, I when I was a kid, right, there was the TV show. I think it was actually called Project Blue Book, and it was that was I think it was on NBC, right, and it was a dramatization of the air. I think it was the Air Force's.
Yeah, the Air Force Project Blue Book.
Investigation, and as I recall, right, it would always be like, like the two Air Force guys were wandering around and they would have some kind of dry, rational explanation. But then you would see like a dramatization of whatever the people described, right? Which made it, so they should have had their cake and they ate it too. And that was also the great age of Leonard Nimoy's In Search of,
Oh, yeah,
where, yeah. Leonard Nimoy would be like, listen. And I live now not that far away from Pine Bush, which is the UFO sighting capital for New York State. And when Whitley Strieber wrote Communion,
oh, yeah.
this is where he was living. So yeah, there's all kinds of there's all kinds of weird things, especially as far as I guess like sort of UFO related stuff.
Right.
That are connected to this area, and there were all sorts of reports like folk stories about like cryptids that live locally, basically like kind of quasi Bigfoot kind of things that are in the mountains. I guess any place you have mountains, it seems that's the Bigfoot character sort of shows up. So yeah, I by no means am I an expert, but I'm utterly fascinated by this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's there's one story about remote viewing. So there's a famous remote viewer. His name's Joe McMoneagle. And you can find this, like, this is literally in a declassified document. What I'm going to say is like, it's going to blow your mind away, but I can produce in fact, it'll show up on the screen when I actually produce this. But there's a declassified document where Joe McMoneagle is an Army remote viewer, and the CIA contracted him to look at a target. And by target, what they do is they give you an envelope and it just has some geospatial coordinates in it. The coordinates could be complete nonsense. It doesn't matter. For some reason, it just works. And they hand him this envelope. He opens it up. He reads the coordinates, and then he just describes what he sees. They don't tell him what he's looking at. They don't tell him, where it is. So he has this target, and he starts talking about like this, desolate place. It's very lonely, and they tell him to like go back 1 million years. Okay, so he's like, here's the target, go back 1 million years. So he says, it's very desolate. There are, I see not people, but like shadows of people, like people used to live here. There's this big pyramid, but it's like the scale, it's hard to describe. It's like pyramids at Giza, but much, much larger. So he just starts. So they said, okay, just go back to when you can see people. So he goes back further. He's like, yeah, like these people, they're really tall, they're really lanky, and they're really, there's this sense of like they've like philosophically made peace with being they're going to go to sleep for a little while. They sent people out to find like their world's dying. This is like a geological death. And he's just explaining all this stuff. It turns out the CIA, the target that they gave him was, you ever see that Cydonia, like that face on Mars?
Mm-hmm.
They sent him there.
Okay. All right.
So like, look, a lot of this stuff, it's like 60%. It works like 50, 60% of the time.
Right.
So a lot of times but there's stories like that have been declassified, like that remote viewing session is declassified. Did he really see Mars 1 million years plus in the past? I don't know. Is it disinformation? I don't know. But I mean, that's a crazy short story, right?
Oh yeah.
You could write fiction and it would be fascinating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's as we were saying before the podcast, I tend to be very skeptical, and I'm almost like rigorously skeptical about things. Maybe too much so. I don't know. I was raised as a devout Roman Catholic, and so if you're Catholic, the world is this kind of numinous place where things are constantly happening. The sort of the presence of God, of the angels, of the devils, of the saints, all of that is surrounding you and is around you and may intercept you and intersect you at any time in any number of ways. And I knew I'm trying to think who it was, someone anyway, a deacon or someone who knew someone who'd attended an exorcism and all this kind of stuff. And so I grew up in a tradition that was very much about the possibility of things that were unearthly, I guess. Mm-hmm. The good or the Jesuits who would talk to you about this would say, well, not necessarily supernatural in most cases, so much as super normal, that there's something that this stuff exists along a continuum that we don't understand, but it's not magic. It's just a kind of science, I guess you would say, that we can't comprehend how it works. And what is it? Arthur C. Clarke says, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I mean, okay, fair enough. And what fascinates me about some of this stuff, right, is that I look at a map of UFO sightings the other day, and they're almost all in the U.S., which doesn't mean they're not happening other places, but is this something does this tell us something about ourselves? That we're so fascinated by these, and maybe it is like advanced technology,
I'll give you a real world example. So I have a classmate who, was involved in the Iraq War. He was a stealth bomber pilot. Mm-hmm. And before they went to do the shock and awe campaign, they would practice bombing runs over Midwestern cities. Mm-hmm. And he said that every time he did one of these practice runs, or not, I should say every time, but several times he did these practice runs or a practice run and people reported UFO sightings.
Yeah.
Right. So they're reporting him. Right. So, a percentage of these things are just obviously natural, natural phenomena, but, it could also be, are they, if you look at the government's ATIP program, we talked about prior to the podcast, where there's the kind of the USS Nimitz incident where they captured, things on camera that were, obviously operating outside of Newtonian physical laws, right? Or maybe not outside of, but they were able to turn without the friction impact and gravitational impact that you would expect from like a fixed wing aircraft. It's not, these things, it could be some natural phenomena that we're just not familiar with. It could be ETs from another world. It could be like a transdimensional entities from, a world that's kind of in superposition with our own at a different frequency. It could be that we're just seeing the effects of, higher physical dimensions projected down to, our 4-dimensional senses. It could be that, there's a fifth force beyond gravitational, weak nuclear, strong nuclear, and what's the one I'm missing? And electromagnetism that we're just not aware of. right? That we can't see yet, we can't detect. It could be, and it could be something supernatural. Who knows? But it doesn't mean that you believe in little green men. It just means that we just don't know what these things are. And if you're in the business of collecting, billions of tax dollars to defend, the country against all threats, if you don't know what these things are, it doesn't really behoove a government to admit that, hey, there's plenty of these things and we don't know what the hell they are. Right? Give us more money, right? Pay more taxes. So I don't know. I feel like things are opening up a bit, but there's also figuring out, kind of siphoning or separating the wheat from the chaff, right? There's a lot of people who just like making up stories for attention. There's for the government, sometimes they have an interest in making these things up in order to protect classified special access programs and things like that they don't want people to know about. But anyway, there's a lot of one book you should check out is Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Just make sure that you do it on a Friday evening or something like that, so you have like a few nights to recover, because you won't be able to sleep when you read about that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that strikes me. There was it was a comic book. This is in the 90s, called Concrete, by a guy named Paul Chadwick. And the gist of it is that this guy gets abducted by aliens, and his brain gets removed from his body and put in this giant sort of concrete form, sort of like the Thing from the Fantastic Four. And he escapes from the aliens, and the government doesn't know what to do with it, because he's this proof of like extraterrestrial exist, but he's just here. And so they decide they're just going to put him out there and just say, oh, he was a result of a failed government program. They're going to hide him in plain sight. And whenever I buy a present for my wife and or my son, I usually do that. I hide it in plain sight, and it works surprisingly well, because you're not, you're just like, oh, all right, whatever. Your mind doesn't track, whatever. So I sort of, some of the stuff that happens, like the whatever the pictures are from the plane cockpits,
the gimbal video and
those things that they really, I mean, to me that looks like some kind of drone technology. Like why is it intercepting a military plane? Because that's what you want something, so what country or what countries does that point in the direction? I mean, it could be us, obviously, but we know, or at least we think we know, or maybe we know that, say, the Chinese tested this hypersonic weapon, and we know that the Russians have been interested in that, and obviously we're interested in it as well. So, to me, that it makes perfect sense to. I mean, it's two things, right? It's a UFO. It's not a drone, It's because I think to myself that like a drone like that would have the ability to intercept a military aircraft. That's what you want. It seems to me anyway. It would probably, and I don't know how it would even work, right? Because that stuff is beyond me. But just, I sort of hypothesize and just think, well, if you could, the aircraft are tens of millions of dollars, right? If you can build a drone that's just a couple million and use that to take out a couple of these aircraft, the cost advantage, like you have the advantage then.
Right.
And I think also by leaking these videos, I guess some of them look kind of fake. I mean, I'm not a good judge of what looks fake and what doesn't. But if there were intelligence analysts on the other side, they're looking at this stuff and they're like, oh man, well, if the Americans have this, then we're in trouble. That there's strategic disinformation too, I guess. Who knows? It could be faked, but it's faked for a reason, right? It then causes the Chinese or the Russians or whoever to say, oh man, well, if they're messing around with that kind of stuff, we need to rethink our plans.
Yeah, I mean, if we have that kind of technology, like the world is the United States, like it's over. At least the speeds and the angles that if you're moving at that speed, you're gonna have drag and you're gonna have to slow down and like turn around. Like these things are just like boom, 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 boom. Like there's nothing. If the Chinese or the Russians had something like this, it's over.
Yeah. some kind of
It's,
inertialess drive, I guess it would be, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's, I mean, I would say like maybe it's some sort of anti-gravity, or at least it behaves that sort of way. And, but again, we only just recently not discovered, but proved that gravity was a wave. And that was in, I guess, 2016 or 20. Somebody won a Nobel, like Kip Thorne won a Nobel Prize for it at Caltech with a bunch of others. But that took like two black holes colliding,
Yeah, releasing
for
the
us
waves.
to,
Yeah.
to detect it from, wherever. So I don't know. And there's also people like the Bob Lazars of the world. Have you heard about this guy?
No, no.
All right. Well, the government's been constantly trying to discredit him, and they might be right. Like he could be lying, but he claims, and this is a guy went back like 30 years ago, and he's still around. But he claimed to have worked on an installation called S4, which is kind of south of Groom Lake, where they were working on propulsion devices,
Mhm.
and or exotic propulsion devices. And he came into this hangar, and there were like 9 different UFO looking things. And he had a partner when they were working on this kind of ball shaped object that they couldn't really figure out how it worked. And apparently the guy's partner, there had been some accident where, again, if this could be real, it could be
right.
a story, but it's still really
story,
interesting.
Yeah.
And apparently he couldn't talk about it, but there had been some accident in trying to figure this thing out, and Bob Lazar was the guy's replacement. He also read some briefing materials on it, and like one or more of these devices had been recovered from archaeological digs. Like, I mean, like really interesting stuff. He talked about an element 115, which at the time didn't exist. Now it does. But it's the version that we're aware of is a very unstable isotope of it, but apparently it was a very stable isotope of element 115. Who knows? But there's a lot of like interesting, I don't want to call it lore, but there's a lot of interesting stories that come out. And the intelligence agencies are constantly monitoring this guy. So there's a guy, Jeremy Corbell, I think, who did a bunch of documentaries on this stuff. There's George Knapp is kind of the journalist who does a lot of this work on UFOs and things like that. But they've interviewed him, and he still maintains his story, but the government's still like tracking him and giving him a hard time, and all sorts of crazy stuff. They've tried to discredit him. Like if you try to look up his, like where he went to school and things like that, it's all disappeared. Again, maybe he's a fraud. Right. It's possible.
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack there.
I know. I could go on for hours of this.
Well, just on the one hand, there was it's a problem with the internet. You run across things and you forget them. Or you forget the details. But there was a guy who was, I think it was a journalist, who was talking to some type of like sort of geological scientist, like dealing with deep time and deep history, this sort of stuff, and said something to the effect of, I think it was actually a projection forward, said, suppose we all disappeared. Like, could a species in the future, when the Beatles take over, whatever, would they be able to tell that we were here? And this guy said, well, you would have to look at very, very specific evidence within like it's, I don't know if it's microscopic, but within different kinds of record for basically climate, I don't know, gases in the atmosphere, whatever. And then that led this scientist to think, man, so like, after a million years, I think it's really hard. It's not impossible, but it's really hard. And of course, you have to know that you're looking for it, right? So we assume that there was in the Earth has been however many billion years old, whatever, four and change, that there's nothing, that there's been no one before us. But this scientist was like, man, I wonder if I should start looking at whatever the fossil record is. So then when you talk about like these kinds of artifacts that may have been found, in archaeological digs, is there you think, oh, well, maybe there was something in the distant past. Could they be probes? I'm not 100% convinced, the extrasolar object that entered the solar system the last year or two, the long flat one that had the Inuit name. There's a scientist at Harvard who's like, you can't rule out that this thing wasn't a probe. And that does not seem unreasonable to me. I'm not saying it seems reasonable, but it just
Right.
as conjecture, that seems fair enough. I also think it's entirely possible. We could certainly have stumbled across things that, or one person could have stumbled across something they don't understand how it works. So you invent some exotic propulsion system, and you're like, I don't really know how this works, and nobody else can figure it out either. And maybe
Well, it's like remote viewing. Like they actually tried to look at quantum mechanics and try to figure out, and they couldn't figure out why it would work sometimes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It just did.
Yeah.
So,
and on the one hand, you have to be, it's funny because my brother's a physician, and I remember him telling me that with medicine, this happens sometimes, that you try something and it works and you're like, okay. I remember him telling me that in ophthalmology in particular, they were really sort of like kind of guilty, quote unquote, of this, that they would just be like, well, it works. So we're not. And so, could there be such things where you've invented some propulsion thing or whatever, and you don't know why it works, and then people are trying to sort of retcon it, try to figure out like a retro engineer, I guess, reverse engineer, how does this thing, this weird sphere, how is it that it moves, or how is it that it did that one thing that it that we saw it do. I'm intrigued with the idea that that the UFO things might have been part of larger disinformation plans, that they may have been part of a different psychological campaign, specifically against the Soviets, but yeah, obviously there's also the possibility that the things could be legit, and what the reasons are, we don't know. We don't know. Man, there's so many things we don't know. I mean, we know that like warp bubbles are theoretically possible, although there's so many problems in terms of steering them and in terms of powering them that we haven't figured out. But I kind of feel like we've started to figure out that, oh, you could move at faster than light speeds, like theoretically. So
right.
Yeah, how long is it before, and it may be a million years, maybe 100 years, let's say, before we figure that out. There were, like, think about Leonardo and all his different designs, and now we build them and we're like, oh wow, no, that really would work. But 500 years ago, that was closer to 6, I guess, at this point, that was just not a practical thing. So I mean, it may be that like 500 years from now, we'll be like, oh, that's how the warp drive works, and boom. So given the age of the cosmos, it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that there are other beings out there who've worked this stuff out. And
well, even basic laws of probability, right? There's trillions of stars, and if you just had a minute probability, and then you're dealing with things on different time scales. Let's say somebody started out 1 million years before we did, right? And look how far we've moved in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Right. Like 100 years ago, I think we were just starting to fly. Right. We've been flying for a little bit, but was it 1911?
Yeah. Think about like somebody who was alive in who was it said this to me, that like somebody who was alive in 1400, if you'd taken them to 1500, they would have seen changes, but they would have kind of basically recognized the world. Somebody who was alive in 1900, take them to 2022, they would find it very, very strange and frightening. I mean, they would still see some similarities, but it would be very, very different. I don't necessarily believe that like all our advanced technology came from the ETs. Like I think that's like we can give ourselves a little bit more credit than that. But could our technology? It's a Star Trek thing, right? You know, when you get warp drive, then the Federation shows up and it's like, hey, welcome to the club. So when you detonate atomic or nuclear weapons, does somebody, you know, show up and say, what's going on here? Because maybe that leads, I mean, who knows where that leads? Maybe it leads someplace good ultimately, in terms of technological sophistication, or maybe they're just like waiting to watch us, you know, nuke ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's also again, without, I'm going to spin a bit of a speculative yarn here, but like, let's say Roswell was real, right? That happened in 1947.
47, right? Yeah, yeah.
And then if you've ever studied how semiconductors work, right? Particularly like solid state physics and things like that. Like, it's, at least to me, when I was studying it as like an engineer, it was not at all intuitive. But like, you had the transistor that suddenly appeared, like, you know, in the 1950s, right after that, and that was how we get to the kind of a binary system of ones and zeros, and that really accelerated. Now, did we develop that on our own? Probably, but could you come up with an alternate explanation where, you know, we're just starting to figure out some of this technology that we recovered? It's possible, but if something's like a million years in the future, it's like, you know, if you went back to the 1880s and stuck like a motorcycle, right? They might be able to figure out how to drive it, but they wouldn't be able to reproduce it or reverse engineer it. Like, it would be so confusing to them, and that's only a few years, separated. So anyway, I know you're probably hitting your hard stop right now, so I could talk about this all day, and I don't want to.
No, it's fascinating stuff, and I think Colin Dickey has written a couple of good books that are about, I think one is called Ghostland, that are about this, about our interest in these. And so they're more, I guess you would say, like sort of anthropological, you know, like relating different stories from different parts of the country. And then why is it that we're interested in these different things? And some of them, you know, cryptids, Bigfoot, something like that, you know, I mean, that's just also probability. You know, why is there no great ape in all of North America? Oh, well, you know, maybe there is. I think, and I think also that it's probably interesting too that our technology has advanced so quickly that it kind of does seem like magic to us. You know, I don't know how my cell phone works. You know, I know that it apparently has all the computing power that NASA had when they sent the astronauts to the moon, like in this little rectangle. But I don't know how they do that. I don't know, you know. So I suppose I can understand how it seems alien in that regard, you know.
But also, you also have access to all human knowledge.
Yeah.
In your fingertips. Like, how's that possible? You can explain
how does that work? And so I can understand why certain things just seem, like they can't be human, you know, that there must be some other explanation, or at least partial explanation for them. I mean, my own view of all the advances in the sort of mid-century is the war. Is basically the war and also and then the Cold War. I think that one just picked up right from the other.
And the space race and all that stuff.
Yeah, and the space race. I just think that all of that was hyper accelerated, and I suspect there are lots of things we don't know about, you know, lots of crazy things, experiments that were tried and so on. I think in Hitler's case and the Nazis' case, you know, they were fighting ultimately with fighting the US and the USSR. The numbers were not their friend. The numbers were not going to work for them. So they were pushing the scientific end of things to see what they could come up with to level the playing field. And I can imagine, you know, we know that they were working on an atomic bomb. We know they had primitive jet fighters and so on. So
they had the first jets, like,
yeah, I could imagine,
deployed against the US. Yeah.
Yeah, I could certainly imagine, you know, the groundwork being laid there. There's nothing like the threat of a bullet to the brain to make you work, you know, very quickly. And I could imagine them. Same thing with with us and with the Soviets too. You know, when Sputnik went up, you have to imagine that, you know, everybody freaked out, but also that they were pushed to to develop. What can you come up with next? Try crazy stuff. What do we think we could do?
Yeah, there is plenty of room for speculation on this, particularly if you're science fiction, horror, fantasy.
Oh yeah. No,
author.
I think
there's plenty of interesting stuff.
A great source
there's
of
one
stories.
Right before we end, I want to. There's a story in Children of the Fang that I can't remember the name of it, but it reminded me a little bit of kind of the Robert E. Howard like shape-shifting serpent people, but it also is the riff of this deep time. What if there was a civilization?
Oh yeah. That's the title story, Children of the Fang.
Yeah, Children of the Fang. That story is mind-blowing. I love that story.
Thank you. Yeah, Ellen Datlow was doing this anthology of Lovecraftian monster stories, and I didn't have a reprint for her, but I was like, I'll write you an original story. And there were these Lovecraft mentions these lizard people in this abandoned city in the empty quarter, I think it is. And and that really stuck with me, also because Howard had used them in some of his Conan stories. So I was just like, okay, let's go with that and see what see where it takes us. Somebody pointed out to me that it's a family story, and I was like, oh yeah, you're right about that.
It is, but I still like the lizard people angle.
Oh yeah, no, but even the lizard people are a family too.
Yeah,
in their own weird way.
All right, my friend, always a pleasure. And
yes, the pleasure's all mine.
I appreciate you taking many hours off of your day off to talk with me.
I am happy to do so.
You can find John Langan's work and Children of the Fang, also Weird World War III, Weird World War IV, and always a great pleasure having you on.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Take care.